So when we have disordered policing in practice, right, this leads to a set of behaviors that may or may not be good, right? So keep in mind, we'll refresh our memories on this particular concept, right? Is that if we think about a city grid, it's funny and maybe irritating is that I have a grid I can follow very carefully and I choose to ignore it with reckless abandon, except for these. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, we know that crime is clustered in certain areas, right? Where it tends to happen and occur in different places, right? So that's accepted. We know that is an empirical regularity that is not necessarily the same spots in the city, but like there are certain spots that are attractors, right? More so than others compared to other communities, right? And more often than not, we know that these areas tend to be marked by poverty. They also tend to be, areas where there is high ethnic heterogeneity, and possibly some unstable populations. AKA, this should sound familiar, like social disorganization theory. So what ends up happening in these communities, right? If you think about what is different compared to these areas, imagine it this way, right? I don't like if you guys have ever been, driving, right, or something like that, right? And this actually happened in the city of Dallas, right? So that something that happened to me. It was like I guess an awakening, right? I said, well, imagine this is downtown Dallas, right? I'm in my car, and I forget where I'm trying to go somewhere, right? And I'm going through downtown, and I'm not totally familiar with the area, so I turn left. Oh God, it's trying to make me draw, and so then I drive over here, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh wow, something there's a noticeable change, right, in this community, right, in that in this area, right, because like oh, that's kind of weird, and then I move up this way and there's more that changes, right? Notable change. How do you know that you tend to be in perhaps a worse off neighborhood? Outside of seeing trash and maybe bars on windows and stuff like that. You tend to also see a lot more people walking than driving, right? Because it tends to be a high poverty area. They don't have access to transportation or personal car. They rely on public transit, or there's a lot more bikes being ridden or something like that, right? So crime tends to be more in areas like this, right? And if we know that this is the way it's going to be, and these are areas where there are more disorder, right? In this case, then, if these also tend to be signs of disorder, and these also happen to be criminals, we are also, if I'm a police agency, I'm going to allocate officers to those areas. Why? Because that's where the need is. And that is something that I need to take care of as a police department, right? And so underneath this disorder policing framework, what we end up having and seeing is that when officers are deployed there, right, they're asked to be part of the community. And also to be more proactive, so not just driving around, so proactive out there, public facing it, right, and interrogating and like not letting minor stuff, right, so taking minor stuff seriously. So what this ends up happening, though, is that relative to other parts of a city, right, you could have what is seen, so, it's something like this, right, where you instigate a trigger for, drinking in public or graffiti or otherwise suspicious activity, whatever, right? If this is the framework for your policing decision, right, you're creating the conditions that can, this does not mean always, but can lead to at least the perception or reality of unfair and biased policing, where it feels targeted among especially in areas that are people with poor and have had, and tend to be people of ethnic minorities, right? So in this case, then, when you have this targeting issue, right, there are a lot of consequences to it, right? Because maybe before police officers were in a position where they would kind of ignore minor stuff or handle it informally, but if this is now the policy that we are, going to trigger the criminal justice system with police officers, and again, right, we are relying on officer discretion to make this judgment call. What the goal is then is to trigger the criminal justice system. So we want to arrest people through CJ system. So we want arrests. We want, in this case, then to give people records as a result, right? Because it's more about communicating specifically, right, that these behaviors will not be tolerated, right? So there's that specific deterrent component as well as the general deterrent component as well, of where you're sending a message to the community that this behavior is not accepted, right? Now the key part here is that this tends to be a very punitive action, right? Where you are, instead of talking to that person, instead of finding an alternative solution, even though that is something disorder policing theory suggests does not get implemented in practice, right? This punitive aspect gets put into place, and as a result, there is a targeting effect, or a perceived targeting effect, of poor people and ethnic minorities relative to other segments of the population. And this, of course, is especially compounded when you have, certain people of ethnic minorities, so, African American, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian communities, right, who have historically poor relationships with police. It's amplified further because the police now are much more punitive. They're much more proactive in the sense of arresting and potentially harassing people more, because they view that as, I am correcting crime. This is my goal in order to do this, right? So there are consequences to this behavior in that, if you're trying to reduce disorder, perhaps you do, but you make trades on police legitimacy. You make a trade in probably fear of police, maybe less than crime. And, to some extent, right, you have to make a judgment call about when do you have enough of a net positive or any costs that are, acquired through this process worth the actual investment in to begin with, right? The other part to consider, too, is that, there tends to be, in practice, not theory, in practice, it's just the enforcement aspect that gets managed, because that is what police are trained to do, right? They become law enforcement people. It is proactive to go out and arrest and give tickets to people. It is proactive to intervene and talk to them. It is proactive to trigger something. It's also, there's a numbers game that's being played with, I'm being active in the police force. I look good for promotions, right? And so from an enforcement perspective, there are incentives from a police officer standpoint to pursue this route, right? And especially since we consider that these are not social workers. And really, all that police are measured by, right? This is very important to remember, right? They're measured by their ability to reduce crime. Very key and important. So from a police department standpoint, as long as the crime numbers are going down relative to other stuff, and I can show that if I am aggressive in this enforcement and I'm able to get high arrest rates, and then later this leads to something, it is considered a success, right? Now, the degree of that is a different story, right? And how efficient that is a different story. And what the consequences are of arresting people, giving them records, and the harms of that is a different story, right? Because police are only measured by this and not other downstream effects related to the criminal justice system. So the other part then is that because there tends to be this focus on arresting, on enforcing the law, then in practice there is less of an emphasis on restoring, rebuilding the community, cleaning up graffiti, picking up trash, and something like that, right? It tends to be just focused on the enforcement aspect. Because of this, right, this is like an incomplete, practice of the theory, and leads to this perception and reality of a harm-based and harm escalating, because we're focusing on minor stuff and making it a bigger deal, policing that may not be net positive, right? So rather than reinvesting in the community, rather than building that relationship, rather than focusing on other aspects, then the goal then, this sort of gets lost in everything because it's just, it leads to negative outcomes that aren't desirable. It leads to a lot of pushback on the police department, and there are damages to be considered, right? The other part too is that at the same time, right, by arresting and having more police activity, does this really lead to less major crime, right? Well, it kind of depends on the way you look at it. If you look at a place like New York City, they're going to claim in the 90s that this led to a major decrease in crime, even though crime was already decreasing in the city before that happened, and similar trends are observed in other cities, right? There is also, this would also be fun to look at for y'all, is stop, question, frisk practices in NYC, where they were looking at the amount of stops that were happening, people questioning them, frisking them, and trying to find weapons. And even though the number of contacts, went up dramatically, some led to arrest, some not, right? But they had a very low success rate in identifying people because they just targeted everyone, right? As a result, the cost of that was a lack of faith in policing, feeling constantly harassed by a police department, and not really feeling like the process was fair, right? So, but if you're able to maybe augment this into being, focused on certain behaviors or identifying this, perhaps that's a different story that could be more effective. Usually, and this is a truism that should be kept up, right? An intentional, purposeful action is harder, right? Because you have to think about a problem, you have to deliver a behavior, you have to find a certain outcome, you have to document it, right? Having said that, right, if with enough thought and time, this is always better than random, arbitrary actions. And so with that, we will end the series of videos. Again, these videos are not supposed to go over every single detail of a principal article, right? But more just to illustrate and expand upon the concepts you've learned about while reading, and possibly provide seeds of discussion. But with that, we'll end this. I say adieu, adieu.